My father didn't let me work because I was a woman. He chose my brother even though he never wanted the job. My father told me I would never run Sinclair and Partners. He handed everything to my brother, the firm, the power, the future that should have been mine. But what happens when the golden boy burns it all down? They never saw me coming. I walked away once, but now they need me. And this time, I have a choice. Save the family empire or burn it to the ground. What would you do? Stay tuned, because this is a story of betrayal, power, and the ultimate revenge. I sat across from my father in his grand office, the scent of aged whiskey and cigars clinging to the air like an unspoken judgment. The walls, lined with towering bookshelves filled with legal volumes, felt like a fortress, a place where men built their legacies and passed them down like heirlooms, a place where I had fought, scraped, and bled to belong. And yet, no matter how many late nights I had spent perfecting my craft, no matter how many cases I had won, no matter how much I had sacrificed, none of it mattered. Not to him, because I wasn't his son. Douglas Sinclair leaned back in his leather chair, adjusting the cufflinks on his tailored suit like a man who had never questioned his place in the world. Nathan is my eldest. He will take over Sinclair and Partners, he said, his voice as measured and authoritative as ever, yet so final it made my stomach twist. This firm has been passed from father to son for generations. That is how it has always been. I clenched my fists beneath the polished oak desk, nails digging into my palms. I had seen this moment coming, had known deep down that he would never let me have what I had rightfully earned. But somehow, some foolish, desperate part of me had still hoped that maybe, after years of proving myself, he would finally see me as something more than just his daughter. That I had more than earned my place at that table. That I was better than Nathan. That I had outworked and outperformed him at every turn. But my father's mind had been made up long before this conversation even began. Nathan doesn't even want this, I said, my voice tight with frustration, barely able to contain the betrayal burning in my chest. You know that, Dad. He barely made it through law school. He's reckless. He doesn't care about the firm. Hell, half the time, he doesn't even show up on time. Douglas let out a slow, deliberate sigh, rubbing his temple as if I were the one being difficult. Nathan will learn, he said simply. He's a Sinclair. This is his birthright. Birthright. The word sat heavy in the air between us. It didn't matter how hard I worked. It didn't matter that I had graduated at the top of my class from Yale Law, that I had clerked for a federal judge, that I had earned the respect of some of the toughest attorneys in New York. It didn't matter that I was the best damn lawyer this firm had ever seen, because I was a woman, and that in his eyes would never be enough. I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. So that's it? That's what my entire career boils down to? I could be the best litigator this firm has ever seen, and it still wouldn't matter because I wasn't born with the right anatomy? For the first time, my father met my gaze, and for a brief moment, something flickered in his expression. Regret? Guilt? Maybe even shame? But it was gone too quickly to tell. You have other paths, Eleanor, he said, his voice softer now, but no less condescending. A future that doesn't involve the burden of running this firm. You'll marry well, have a family, you have got to be kidding me. I cut him off, my breath catching in my throat. Are you seriously telling me to just accept this and play the part of some trophy wife, while Nathan runs this firm into the ground? His jaw tightened. Watch your tone. No. I stood up, shoving my chair back. This isn't about protecting me. This is about you being too damn stuck in your ways to see what's right in front of you. I've earned this, and you know it. A long silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken words, with years of disappointment and resentment. And then, finally, he spoke. That's enough, he said, his voice sharp. We're done here. Just like that. No discussion. No consideration. Just another decision made without me, for me, as if I had never even been part of the equation. I stood there for a moment, my breath coming fast, my chest rising and falling with the weight of what had just happened. And then, without another word, I turned on my heel and walked out, my heels clicking against the polished marble floors. As I moved through the hallway, my pulse pounding in my ears, I caught sight of my mother in the parlor, arranging fresh flowers in a crystal vase. She looked up at me, her expression unreadable, but I saw the way her fingers stilled over the petals. "Eleanor," she said softly, as if she already knew. I stopped in my tracks, the lump in my throat tightening. "He's giving it to Nathan," I said, my voice trembling with disbelief, anger, hurt. "He won't even consider me." My mother's lips parted slightly, but she didn't look surprised, just resigned. And somehow, that hurt even more. "Your father," she started hesitantly. "He has his ways. Maybe it's best not to push him." I stared at her, stunned. "You're defending him?" She exhaled, glancing down at the flowers in her hands. "I just don't want to see you get hurt," she murmured. "Sometimes it's easier to let things be." "Easier for who?" My voice cracked. "Because it sure as hell isn't easier for me." She lowered her gaze, and that was answer enough. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the weight pressing down on my chest. The years of hard work, the late nights, the sacrifices, had it all been for nothing? My whole life I had fought to prove myself, to stand toe-to-toe with the best in the field. And yet, in my father's eyes, I was still just his daughter. A woman, someone to be married off and kept out of the way. No, I wouldn't accept that. By the time the sun rose, I had made my decision. I was leaving. And when I walked out of that house, I wasn't just walking away from my father's firm. I was walking towards something better, something I was going to build for myself, with or without them. New York had always felt alive, but tonight it pulsed beneath me like a living thing, thrumming with the energy of people who never stopped moving, never stopped chasing something. The city didn't care who you were, where you came from, or what name you carried. It only cared about what you could do, and that was exactly why I had chosen to build my future here. No nepotism, no legacy hires, no last names that open doors. Just raw talent, ambition, and the ability to fight harder than the person sitting across from you. It had been nearly a year since I walked out of my father's house with nothing but a suitcase, and the weight of my own rage pressing down on me. And now I was here, Eleanor Sinclair, attorney at Hamilton and Associates, one of the most respected law firms in New York. A name built on merit, not birthright. It hadn't been easy. I had clawed my way up, taking on the toughest cases, proving myself again and again. I worked late nights, outmaneuvered ruthless attorneys twice my age, and made sure that no one ever looked at me and saw Douglas Sinclair's daughter. No, they saw me for what I was, a force to be reckoned with. I had started over, built something real, something that belonged to me. And for the first time in my life, I thought I had finally broken free from my family's shadow. Until tonight. The phone call had come out of nowhere. I had been sitting in my apartment, poring over depositions, a glass of bourbon untouched beside me, when the screen lit up with a name I never expected to see. Nathan. I had stared at it for a long moment, my chest tightening, before finally picking up. "You actually answered," he had said, his voice carrying that same smug arrogance he'd always had. But beneath it, something else. Something off. "What do you want, Nathan?" I had asked, already regretting answering. A pause, a sharp inhale. Then, the firm's in trouble. I had laughed, the sound bitter, sharp. "Oh, you don't say." What happened? Finally realized running a law firm requires more than just existing. "Eleanor, I'm serious." That was the moment I knew something was wrong. Nathan never dropped the act, never let his voice carry even a hint of weakness. But now, there was something almost desperate clinging to his words. I had leaned forward, my fingers tightening around the phone. "What's going on?" "A lawsuit," he said. "A big one. Breach of contract. Millions on the line." The client Vanguard Industries, they're coming for blood. And Dad, he trailed off, and in that silence, I felt the weight of what he wasn't saying. Dad's not handling it well. I had exhaled sharply, shaking my head. Not my problem. It will be when the firm collapses. Nathan had snapped. And there was the real fear. Not just about the case, about everything. You don't get it, Ellie. If we lose this, it won't just be a payout. It'll be the end of Sinclair and Partners. The partners are panicking. Clients are already pulling back. If we don't turn this around, you mean if you don't turn it around, I had corrected. A long silence. Then, softer, like he hated the words he was about to say. We need you. I had closed my eyes, the words hitting me harder than they should have. For years, I had fought for a seat at that table, had begged for the chance to prove I was the best thing that firm had ever seen, and they had shut me out. Now, when they were on the brink of collapse, they wanted me back. You should have thought about that before you threw me aside, I had said coldly. Jesus, Eleanor, Nathan had muttered. You really gonna let this place burn just to make a point? I had swallowed, forcing down the mix of emotions rising in my throat. I owed them nothing. They had made their choice. And yet, I had sighed, rubbing my temple. Does Dad know you're calling me? Another pause. That told me everything. No, Nathan had admitted, but he will. A bitter smirk had curled my lips. He's gonna love that. Just think about it, he had said. We need someone who actually knows what the hell they're doing. And whether you like it or not, that's you. I had hung up without another word, staring at my phone as if it had betrayed me. My pulse had been thrumming, my mind already racing ahead, weighing every possible outcome. I could walk away. Let them crash and burn, just like they had let me drown all those years ago. Or I could step in. Not to save them, not to be the good daughter, but to take what should have been mine in the first place. That was how I found myself here, standing in front of Sinclair and Partners' towering glass building, staring up at the name etched into steel above the entrance. For so long, I had dreamed of walking through these doors as the rightful heir to the empire my father had built. And now, I was walking in as its potential savior or its executioner. The moment I stepped inside, I felt the shift, the hushed whispers, the lingering stares. Some people recognized me. Some barely looked up, but the energy was different. This wasn't the confident, untouchable Sinclair and Partners I had left behind. No, this was a firm on the verge of collapse, desperate, fractured. Nathan was waiting for me near the elevator, arms crossed, looking as smug as ever despite the disaster looming over his head. Glad you could make it, he said. Don't get used to it, I shot back. We rode up in silence, the weight of old grudges and unspoken words pressing in around us. When the elevator doors slid open, I stepped out, my heels clicking against the marble floor. As I walked through the hallway I had once known like the back of my hand. My father's office door loomed ahead, and for the first time in years, I hesitated. Then, I pushed the door open without knocking. Douglas Sinclair sat behind his massive desk, a storm brewing in his cold blue eyes. The second he saw me, he didn't stand, didn't greet me, just exhaled slowly, as if my presence alone exhausted him. Eleanor, he said, voice measured, controlled. I see Nathan took it upon himself to... I don't give a damn what Nathan did, I cut him off, stepping forward. Let's skip the bullshit, Dad. You need me, and we both know it. His jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. I let the silence stretch between us, then smirked. So, tell me, Douglas, how does it feel to realize you backed the wrong horse? His expression remained unreadable, but something in his posture shifted. A subtle, almost imperceptible change. A realization. I wasn't here to ask for a seat at the table. I was here to take it. He thought I'd protect him. He thought I'd fix his mess, just like always. But this time, I had the power, and Nathan knew it. The question was, would I use it to destroy him or take control of everything he thought was his? What do you think? Should I expose his fraud and let the world watch him fall? Or should I play the long game and claim my place at the top? Comment 1, if I should take him down. Or 2, if I should use his mistake to seize power for myself. Let me know, because things are about to get dangerous. The air in my father's office was thick with tension, the kind that clung to your skin and made it impossible to breathe. I could feel the weight of his stare, assessing, calculating, already deciding how he was going to spin this situation to his advantage. But this time, he didn't hold the upper hand. I did, and he knew it. You think you can just walk in here and take control? Douglas finally said, his voice calm but laced with irritation, like I was an inconvenience rather than the one person capable of saving his firm from collapsing under the weight of its own incompetence. I smiled, slow and deliberate, knowing it would piss him off. No, I think I already have. Nathan scoffed from the corner of the room, where he was leaning against the bookshelf, arms crossed like he had something to say but wasn't quite ready to throw himself into the fire just yet. I didn't blame him. He knew better than anyone how this was going to play out. He had underestimated me his entire life, and every time, I had proven him wrong. Douglas leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled together as he studied me. If you're going to do this, you need to understand one thing, he said, his voice taking on that signature measured tone, the one he used when he was about to deliver a lesson he thought was invaluable. This firm isn't about one case. It's about legacy, power, the long game. You can't just win this lawsuit and think that earns you a seat at the table. I tilted my head, feigning curiosity. So what does earn me a seat? Being born with the right last name? Oh, wait, I was. Didn't seem to matter much, though, did it? His jaw tightened, just a fraction. A win. Vanguard's case isn't just a lawsuit, Nathan finally spoke up, pushing off the bookshelf. It's a power play. If we lose, the partners will start looking for an exit strategy. Clients will jump ship. And you know how this industry works. Ellie, once the cracks show, the whole foundation crumbles. I turned to him, arms crossed. So let me get this straight, you screw up. And now I'm supposed to clean up your mess before the entire firm collapses? Tell me, Nathan, what exactly have you been doing this whole time? Aside from proving Dad wrong about who he should have trusted to run this place? Nathan's smirk faltered, just slightly, before he masked it with indifference. I've been handling it. I let out a short laugh. Right, and how's that going? Douglas exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple like he was already tired of this conversation. Enough. If you're here, then you're here. No more wasting time. I need to know what you plan to do. I stepped forward, planting my hands on his desk, leaning in just enough to remind him that I wasn't afraid of him. First things first, I need full access to the case files, every contract, every email, every internal memo that's even remotely relevant. If I'm going to clean up your mess, I need to see exactly how deep the rot goes. Douglas didn't flinch. Fine. And, I continued, pushing harder now, I work this case my way. No interference. No second guessing. No Nathan suddenly deciding he wants to play lawyer and getting in my way. Nathan scoffed again. I don't. Shut up, Nathan. The first snapped, not even bothering to look at him. You lost the right to an opinion when you let this firm walk into a multi-million-dollar disaster. His mouth opened, like he wanted to argue, but he closed it again. Smart choice. Douglas watched me for a long moment before nodding. All right, he said. You have control over the case. But if you screw this up, I won't. I cut in. He gave a slow nod, but there was something behind his eyes. Something calculating, like he was already planning for the moment I failed. That was fine. Let him underestimate me. Let him think I was just another desperate Sinclair trying to prove myself. I didn't need his approval. I didn't even need his trust. I just needed the power to do what he never believed I could. Without another word, I turned and strode out of the office, the weight of the moment settling in my chest like a storm rolling in. This wasn't just about saving the firm. This was about proving that I never needed them in the first place. As I stepped into the main office space, heads turned. Some people whispered. Some watched openly, curiosity and apprehension etched into their faces. To them, I was the daughter who had walked away. Now, I was the woman who had returned not as a supplicant, but as their best chance at survival. Miss Sinclair, a voice called from behind me. I turned to see a junior associate, her hands full of files. I have the initial case documents ready for you. I took the stack from her, flipping through the top pages as I made my way toward what used to be my office. It wasn't technically mine anymore, but I didn't plan on asking permission to take it back. Inside, I shut the door, exhaling as I dropped the files onto the desk. My fingers traced the Sinclair and Partners emblem embossed on the folder, the weight of it almost suffocating. This firm had been built on tradition, on the idea that power was inherited, not earned. But I wasn't here to inherit anything. I was here to take it. I pulled out the first document, scanning the contents, and within seconds my stomach twisted. The numbers didn't add up. The contract had been manipulated. Someone had tried to cover their tracks, and they had done a piss-poor job of it. I grabbed my pen and started marking the inconsistencies, my pulse picking up speed. This wasn't just a mistake, this was a cover-up, and I was going to find out exactly who was responsible. The deeper I dug into the case, the worse it got. Every document I combed through, every email thread I analyzed, every contract amendment I dissected, it all pointed to the same undeniable conclusion. Someone at Sinclair and Partners had tried to bury this, and they had done it in the sloppiest way possible. The numbers didn't add up, the contract revisions were inconsistent, and the internal memos were vague enough to be deliberate. This wasn't negligence, it was fraud. The kind that could dismantle the entire firm if the wrong people got their hands on it. And knowing how the legal world worked, it was only a matter of time before someone did. I sat in my office, surrounded by stacks of files, my desk a battlefield of red-marked documents and hastily scribbled notes. The city lights outside blurred as I flipped through another set of financial statements, my pulse steady but my mind racing. If I was right and I was then someone had forged documents to cover up a breach of contract with Vanguard Industries. A breach that had cost Vanguard millions. And now they were coming for revenge. A sharp knock on the door pulled me from my thoughts. I glanced up, already knowing who it was before I even said, "Come in." Nathan strolled in like he owned the place. The same smug energy he always carried, but there was tension in his posture. Like he was waiting for a fight. I didn't make him wait long. I tossed a marked-up document across the desk. "You want to tell me what the hell this is?" Nathan barely glanced at it before sinking into the chair across from me. "I don't know, Eleanor. Looks like a bunch of numbers. Should I be impressed?" I leaned forward, hands flat on the desk. "It's fraud, Nathan, and not the kind you can just brush under the rug. Somebody in this firm falsified records to cover up the breach with Vanguard. You want to tell me who?" His jaw tightened for a fraction of a second. That was all the confirmation I needed. "I have no idea what you're talking about," he said smoothly. But there was an edge to his voice now. I let out a sharp laugh, shaking my head. "Cut the bullshit. I know you, Nathan. You panic when you're cornered, and I'm telling you right now, you're cornered. The numbers don't lie. The emails don't lie. This firm tried to shift the blame onto Vanguard, and they're about to bury us for it." Nathan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "Look, it wasn't supposed to get this far." My stomach twisted. "So it was you." I didn't say that, but the way his gaze darted to the door, the way his fingers tapped against the armrest, told me everything. I pushed back in my chair, arms crossed. "Do you have any idea what you've done? We're talking about criminal liability. If this goes public, it won't." He leaned forward now, his voice dropping lower. "We can fix this." I laughed again, but this time, there was no humor in it. "Fix it? Nathan, this isn't some parking ticket you can make disappear. You doctored financial records. That's felony territory. If Vanguard pushes this, if this goes to court, you're not just losing a lawsuit. You're looking at prison." Nathan's face paled. just slightly, but he recovered fast. Dad doesn't know. That stopped me cold. What? He swallowed, glancing toward the door again, as if expecting our father to materialize out of thin air. He doesn't know. About the cover-up, about the fraud. He thinks it's just a breach of contract case gone bad. I let the weight of that settle over me. Douglas Sinclair was ruthless, but he wasn't reckless. He wouldn't have signed off on something this stupid, which meant Nathan had gone rogue, and now he had dragged the entire firm down with him. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay calm. So let me get this straight. You lied to Dad, you covered up the breach, you falsified records, and now you expect me to, what? Make it all disappear? Nathan smirked, but it was weaker than usual. You're the best lawyer in this firm, aren't you? Figure it out. I stared at him, my blood thrumming with barely contained fury. For years, he had been given everything. The firm, the trust, the future that should have been mine. And this was what he had done with it. I stood, gathering the documents into a neat pile. You don't get to make demands, Nathan. Not anymore. He tilted his head, studying me. What are you gonna do? Tell Dad? Expose the firm? Burn the whole thing to the ground? I held his gaze, unflinching. I haven't decided yet. Something flickered in his expression, fear, maybe. Or maybe just the realization that for the first time in his life, he wasn't holding the cards. He pushed up from his chair, brushing imaginary lint from his sleeve. Be careful, Ellie. You think you're in control, but this isn't your game? I smirked, tilting my head. Then you should be really scared, because I don't play by the rules. He didn't have a response to that. Just turned and walked out, leaving me alone in the dimly lit office, the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I sat back down, staring at the mess of paperwork in front of me. There was no easy way out of this. If I exposed the fraud, the firm would collapse, my father would take the fall, and Nathan, well, he'd get exactly what he deserved. If I covered it up, I'd be no better than him. But there was a third option. I could use this. I picked up my pen, tapping it against the desk as a slow, dangerous smile spread across my lips. Nathan thought I was here to save him. He had no idea I was here to take everything. The office was silent after Nathan left, but my mind wasn't. It was moving a mile a minute, running through every possible scenario, every move I could make. There was no denying the power I held now. I had the proof, the leverage, and most importantly, I had the one thing my father valued above all else: control. Nathan had given it to me on a silver platter, too arrogant to realize the gravity of his mistake. He thought I'd protect him, that I'd do what I always did, fix his messes and let him walk away unscathed. Not this time. I picked up the top document, my eyes scanning the incriminating details one more time. The fraud wasn't just sloppy, it was desperate. The timeline was erratic, the amendments rushed, the numbers tweaked just enough to make them seem plausible, but not enough to hide the lie from someone who actually knew how to look. Whoever had orchestrated this had been reckless, acting in panic rather than strategy. That wasn't like my father. And it sure as hell wasn't like the senior partners. That left one person, Nathan. I exhaled slowly, rubbing my temples. This wasn't just about winning a case anymore. This was about dismantling the lie my family had built, brick by brick. My father had spent decades shaping this firm into something untouchable, a fortress of power and influence. But the foundation was rotten and the cracks were spreading. And now I had to decide, did I let it collapse, or did I use this as my way in? A knock at the door snapped me out of my thoughts. This time, it wasn't Nathan. It was my father. Douglas Sinclair stepped inside like he owned the place, which, technically, he did. For now, his eyes swept over my desk, taking in the scattered files, the highlighted contracts, the case notes filled with sharp annotations. He didn't sit. He just stood there, watching me, his expression unreadable. I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms. To what do I owe the pleasure? He exhaled, slow and deliberate, as if choosing his words carefully. Nathan spoke to you. It wasn't a question. I tapped a pen against the desk, feigning disinterest. He did. My father nodded once, stepping further into the room. And what? I tilted my head. Are you asking if I'm going to expose the fact that your golden boy just committed fraud? Because I haven't decided yet. His expression didn't change, but I saw the slight tension in his jaw, the way his hands flexed at his sides. My father didn't do fear, but he did understand risk. And right now, I was the biggest risk he'd ever faced. You're not going to destroy this firm, he said, voice calm, controlled. I arched a brow. No? And why's that? He took a step closer, his eyes locking onto mine. Because it's yours as much as it's mine. I laughed at that, shaking my head. Since when? Since the moment you realized Nathan wasn't fit to run it? Since the second you understood that I'm the only person who can fix this mess? Or was it always mine, and you just refused to admit it? His silence was answer enough. I leaned forward, my tone dropping to something quieter, sharper. You knew. Maybe not about the fraud, maybe not about the specifics, but you knew Nathan wasn't capable. You knew he would crash and burn the second you handed him the reins. And you let it happen. His jaw tightened. I was giving him a chance. No, I corrected. You were hoping. Hoping that blood would be enough to make him a leader. Hoping that legacy would outweigh competence. Hoping that you'd never have to admit that you made the wrong choice. A beat of silence stretched between us. Then, finally, he sighed. What do you want, Eleanor? There it was. The moment I had been waiting for. I took my time answering, letting the weight of the question settle in the air. My entire life, I had fought to prove myself to this man. I had done everything right, excelled, achieved, worked twice as hard for half the recognition, and he had never once asked me what I wanted. But now, he didn't have a choice. I want control, I said, voice steady. I want full authority over this case. No interference. No Nathan whispering in your ear. No senior partners trying to push me aside. I call the shots. Douglas studied me, his face giving nothing away. And after that? I smiled, slow and calculated. We'll see. His gaze flickered with something I couldn't quite place. Respect? Amusement? Maybe even regret? It didn't matter. He wasn't my concern. Not anymore. Fine, he said after a long pause. Handle it. I stood, extending a hand across the desk. You have a deal. He hesitated for only a fraction of a second before shaking it. And just like that, I had won. My father turned to leave, pausing at the door. Be careful, Eleanor, I smirked. I always am. As soon as he was gone, I let out a slow breath, my fingers tightening around the edges of the case files. I had what I wanted. Full control, power. The chance to prove once and for all that I was the rightful heir to this firm. But something told me this fight wasn't over. Not yet. The office was empty by the time I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, the weight of my father's words still pressing against my chest. Handle it. 2 words, but they meant everything. He hadn't said I trust you. He hadn't said you were right. No, Douglas Sinclair didn't give out approval. He gave assignments, orders. And this was a test. He wanted to see if I could do what he had never believed I was capable of, fixing a mess that should have never been mine to clean. I exhaled sharply, pushing away from my desk. The city lights spilled through the windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. The entire building was quiet now, the hum of ringing phones and hushed conversations long gone. I liked it better this way. No distractions. Just me and the battlefield in front of me. I grabbed the nearest file, flipping it open, my eyes scanning the contract again. The fraud wasn't just a single mistake, it was systematic, layered. Someone had tried to make sure the cover-up held, and they had almost pulled it off. Almost. I ran my fingers over the margins, my mind already breaking down every possible angle. If I played this right, if I maneuvered the case the way I needed to, I wouldn't just win. I'd own them. All of them. A sharp knock on the door made me glance up. I already knew who it was. Still here? Richard Hayes leaned against the doorframe, his sharp eyes scanning the room. He looked amused, but I knew him well enough to recognize when he was studying someone, waiting for a move he couldn't predict. I smirked, closing the file. What gave it away? He stepped inside, taking in the mess of paperwork, the half-empty coffee cup on the desk. You always did like a good fight. Must be why I work in litigation. I folded my arms, studying him right back. What do you want, Richard? The first heard you got what you wanted. He gave a slow nod, crossing the room until he was standing across from me. Full control over the case. Must have been one hell of a conversation. I shrugged, but we both knew better. I made my case. He saw a reason. Richard chuckled. Is that what we're calling it now? I didn't respond. He sat down across from me, his expression turning serious. This thing with Vanguard, how bad is it? I let out a slow breath, tapping my fingers against the desk. Bad enough that if we don't handle it right, Sinclair and partners won't survive it. Richard didn't blink. And you? Will you survive it? I met his gaze, unwavering. I don't plan on losing. A beat of silence stretched between us, thick with something unspoken. Richard had always been one of the few people in this world who saw me for exactly what I was. Not just Douglas Sinclair's daughter, not just an attorney clawing her way up, but something sharper, more dangerous. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. You're playing a long game here, Eleanor. I can see it. I tilted my head. And what game do you think that is? The one where you don't just win this case. His lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. You take everything. I didn't confirm or deny it. Instead, I leaned back, watching him the way he watched me. You sound like you don't approve. I didn't say that. He smirked. I just hope you know what you're doing. I always do. Richard studied me for another long moment before standing. Then I'll see you in court. I nodded, watching as he left, the door clicking shut behind him. I exhaled, my fingers tightening around the armrests of my chair. Richard was right. This wasn't just about winning. It never had been. This was about taking what should have been mine from the beginning, and I wasn't going to stop until I had it all. The courtroom was silent except for the rhythmic ticking of the clock. Above the judge's bench, each second stretching longer than the last. My fingers curled around the edge of the polished table, my pulse steady, my breathing controlled. This was it, the moment everything had been leading up to. The moment I proved, once and for all, that I wasn't just Douglas Sinclair's daughter, I was the one who should have been sitting in his chair all along. Across the room, Nathan sat stiffly beside our father, his expression carefully blank, but I could see the tension in the way his hands gripped the documents in front of him. He knew. He knew I had the upper hand, and it was killing him. My father, on the other hand, was as composed as ever. His face was a mask of indifference, his posture relaxed. But I knew better. I had spent my entire life learning how to read him, and I could see at the flicker of something in his eyes. Not fear, not yet, but doubt. Good. Vanguard's lead attorney, Julia Monroe, stood with the kind of confidence that came from knowing you had an airtight case. And she did, because if I hadn't been the one on the other side of this table, Sinclair and partners would already be drowning. Your Honor, Julia said, stepping toward the bench, her voice crisp, professional. The evidence is clear. Sinclair and partners knowingly falsified financial records to shift liability onto my client. The fraudulent amendments to the contract are undeniable, and we have ample documentation proving the deliberate misrepresentation of facts. This is not just a breach of contract. This is corporate fraud. She let the words hang in the air, knowing exactly what kind of damage they carried. The judge's eyes flicked toward me, waiting. I rose slowly, smoothing my hands over my skirt. and took a deliberate step forward. "With all due respect, Your Honor," I said, my voice steady, unwavering. "Miss Monroe is mistaken." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Julia's eyes narrowed. I could feel Nathan shift beside my father, probably wondering what the hell I was doing. But I wasn't here to defend the firm the way they expected. I was here to win. I turned toward the judge, pacing slowly. "The evidence does suggest misconduct," I conceded, watching Julia's lips curve into a satisfied smirk. I let her have it for exactly 3 seconds. However, the key question here is who was responsible for that misconduct. The smirk vanished. "Sinclair and Partners is a firm built on reputation, on trust," I continued, keeping my voice even, my movements controlled. And yes, somewhere along the line that trust was broken. But not by this firm as a whole, by an individual. I turned then, letting my gaze land squarely on Nathan. His body tensed. A muscle in his jaw twitched. I could hear my father inhale sharply, but he didn't say a word. "Your Honor," I said, stepping closer to the judge's bench. The defense moves to submit new evidence. Another wave of murmurs. The judge frowned. "Miss Sinclair, you've had ample opportunity to present evidence before this hearing. What exactly are you introducing now?" Without breaking eye contact with Nathan, the first reached into my briefcase and pulled out a thick folder, placing it on the table. "Internal communications," I said smoothly. "Financial records, emails detailing the modification of contracts and the concealment of liability, all signed off by one person, Nathan Sinclair." The color drained from his face. "Objection." Julia's voice was sharp, but there was something behind it now, uncertainty. "This is a last-minute attempt to shift blame." "The evidence speaks for itself," I interrupted, turning toward her. "Your Honor, if Miss Monroe would like to take the time to review the documents, I'm happy to wait." I wasn't, but I would, because I knew what was in those files. I had spent the last 48 hours going through every single email, every single transaction, tracing the deception right back to its source. And now I had laid it all out for everyone to see. The judge exhaled, glancing between us before finally nodding. "We'll take a recess to review the evidence." The second the gavel struck, Nathan shot up from his chair, his face a mask of barely contained rage. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he hissed, storming toward me. I turned slowly, meeting his fury with cold indifference. "What does it look like? You're throwing me under the bus?" His voice was low, dangerous. "After everything? After everything?" I laughed, shaking my head. "You mean after you nearly burned this firm to the ground? After you committed fraud and expected me to clean it up? No, Nathan. I'm not throwing you under the bus. I'm making sure you take the fall you deserve." His hands clenched into fists. "Dad won't let this happen." I arched a brow. Dad doesn't have a choice. For the first time, real fear flashed across his face. Because he knew I was right. My father might be ruthless, but he was also practical. And if it came down to choosing between protecting Nathan or saving the firm, Nathan was already dead weight. I turned to leave, but his voice stopped me. "This isn't over, Ellie." I looked back at him, my smile razor sharp. "Oh, I know." Then I walked away, my heels clicking against the polished floor, knowing that no matter how this case ended, Nathan Sinclair had already lost. The tension in the room was suffocating when the court reconvened. The judge had reviewed the documents I submitted, and now, all eyes were on Sinclair and Partners. Nathan sat stiffly beside my father, his fingers twitching against the table, his jaw tight with barely restrained fury. I could feel it, the slow, creeping realization sinking into him. This wasn't just a setback. This was the beginning of the end. Douglas Sinclair, however, was unreadable. He hadn't said a word to me since I dropped the evidence in front of the entire courtroom, and I wasn't naive enough to think he would offer an apology. No, my father wasn't the type to admit he had made the wrong choice. But the silence, the lack of his usual measured control, told me everything I needed to know. I had backed him into a corner. Julia Monroe, Vanguard's attorney, stood and straightened her jacket, her expression sharper than before. She knew the power had shifted, and she was about to twist the knife. "Your Honor," she began, addressing the judge, "given the overwhelming evidence submitted against Nathan Sinclair, Vanguard Industries would like to amend the claim to directly seek damages from the individual responsible rather than the firm as a whole." The courtroom murmured, but I barely heard it. Nathan went rigid beside my father. "Checkmate." "Your Honor," I said, standing, my voice smooth and controlled. "Sinclair and Partners does not object to the amendment." Nathan snapped his head toward me so fast I thought he might break something. "You can't be serious," he hissed under his breath. "You're feeding me to them?" I turned slightly, just enough to meet his furious glare. "You fed yourself to them." The judge looked over the paperwork again, nodding slowly. "Request granted. The lawsuit will proceed with Nathan Sinclair named as the primary defendant." Nathan shot up from his seat. "This is bullshit!" His voice rang out across the courtroom, drawing gasps from the spectators. The bailiff took a step forward, but the judge held up a hand. "Mr. Sinclair," he said sternly, "sit down before I hold you in contempt." I almost smiled at the way Nathan clenched his fists, his shoulders tight with barely contained rage. He had spent his whole life believing he was untouchable, that he could get away with anything because of his last name. But now, he was just another man who had played a bad hand. Douglas remained seated, his face unreadable, his fingers tapping a slow, calculated rhythm against the table. He didn't look at Nathan, he didn't try to intervene, because he knew. He knew there was no coming back from this. Nathan turned to him, his voice lower now, edged with something almost desperate. "Dad," he muttered under his breath, "say something." Douglas finally looked at his son, not with anger, not with disappointment, just quiet, exhausted resignation. "I warned you," he said simply. Nathan flinched like he had been struck. That was it. The moment I saw the shift in his eyes, it wasn't just anger anymore, it was fear. For the first time in his life, Nathan realized that there wasn't a safety net. No one was coming to save him. I should have felt guilty. Maybe once upon a time I would have. But now, all I felt was the cold, sharp satisfaction of knowing he had finally faced the consequences of his own arrogance. The judge moved on with the proceedings, but I barely heard him. My mind was already 10 steps ahead. This was over. The firm was safe. Vanguard would get their payout. And my father would do what he always did, clean up the mess and move forward. But me? I wasn't just thinking about the case. I was thinking about what came next. Nathan was out. That much was clear. But what about my father? He had always held on to Sinclair and Partners with an iron grip, refusing to acknowledge that I was the rightful heir to everything he had built. But today, for the first time, he had stayed silent. He had let me take control. That silence spoke louder than any words he could have said. I had proven myself, not to him, not to the firm, but to myself. As the gavel struck and the hearing concluded, I gathered my things and stood. Nathan didn't move. He just sat there, staring blankly at the table in front of him. I leaned in close, my voice quiet, just for him. "Next time, Nathan, don't bet against me." Then I turned and walked away. As I stepped into the hallway, the weight of it all hit me not as pressure, but as clarity. I had won. Not just this case, but everything that mattered. I had carved my place in this firm, in this world, and I had done it without anyone's permission. Douglas Sinclair was waiting near the elevators, his hands in his pockets, watching me with that unreadable expression. "You played it well," he said as I approached. I tilted my head, studying him. "You knew I would." A small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You're ready." The words shouldn't have mattered. Not after everything, but somehow they did. I nodded once. "I've always been ready." The elevator doors slid open. I stepped inside, turning to face him as they began to close. "Try not to let the next heir to the throne burn the place down," I said, smirking. His chuckle was quiet, but it was there. And then the doors shut between us. I wasn't sure where this road would take me next. But I knew one thing for certain, whatever it was, I'd be the one in control. The city stretched out before me, its skyline a jagged silhouette against the early evening sky. From my office, high above the streets of Manhattan, I could see the world-moving cars weaving through traffic, people rushing to their next destination, lights flickering to life as businesses shut down and nightlife began to stir. It was a city that never stopped, never hesitated. It moved forward, whether you were ready for it or not. And tonight, standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows of Sinclair and Partners, I realized something. I had done it. The case was over. Vanguard had won, but more importantly, so had I. Nathan was finished, officially cut off from the firm, from the family, from everything he had once taken for granted. The partners had distanced themselves from him the second they saw the evidence, their loyalty shifting like rats abandoning a sinking ship. My father, ever the strategist, hadn't lifted a finger to save him. It had been brutal. It had been inevitable. And yet, as I watched my brother self-destruct under the weight of his own mistakes, I hadn't felt the satisfaction I expected. Because in the end, I hadn't needed to destroy him. He had done that all on his own. I exhaled, pressing my fingers against the cool glass. The weight of everything settled over me, not in the way that suffocated, but in the way that solidified. I had spent years fighting for a place at this table, for recognition, for validation, but now that I had it, I found myself wondering if I even wanted it. A knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. I turned to see my father standing there, hands in his pockets, watching me with that same unreadable expression he had always worn. "Douglas," I said smoothly, because calling him Dad had stopped feeling right a long time ago. He stepped inside, glancing around the office that had once belonged to one of the senior partners, the same office that, as of this morning, had been handed to me. His gaze lingered on the desk, the nameplate that hadn't been replaced yet. "Comfortable?" he asked. I smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "Getting there." He nodded, walking further inside, his movements slow, deliberate. "You did what needed to be done," he said finally. "Nathan was a liability. You handled it." I let out a short laugh. "Handled it? Is that what we're calling it?" He tilted his head slightly. "Would you rather I call it what it was? A coup?" I met his gaze, unflinching. "Call it whatever you want. You knew the second I stepped back into this firm that I wasn't going to settle for anything less than control." His lips curved just slightly, the closest thing he ever got to approval. "And now you have it." There was something in his tone that made me pause. I studied him, searching for whatever game he was playing now. "And what about you?" I asked. "What about me? You're not the type to hand over power without an angle. So what is it? Are you stepping back? Letting me take the reins?" Douglas exhaled slowly, walking over to the bar cart in the corner and pouring himself a drink. He took his time, as if considering his words carefully. Then, finally, he said, "I built this firm from nothing. I made it what it is today, but I won't be around forever." He turned, glass in hand, his sharp blue eyes locking onto mine. "You've proven yourself, Eleanor, more than I ever expected. The partners see it, the clients see it. Hell, even I see it." He took a sip, watching me over the rim of his glass. "But power isn't just given. You know that better than anyone." I folded my arms. "Then what are you saying?" His gaze didn't waver. "I'm saying, if you want this firm, if you want everything I've built, you have to be willing to do what it takes to keep it." The weight of his words settled between us. He wasn't talking about Nathan anymore. He wasn't talking about this one case. He was talking about the long game, about how this world worked. It wasn't enough to win once. You had to keep winning. Every day, against everyone. I took a step closer, my voice quiet but firm. I didn't fight my way back here just to lose it. "Good," he said simply. Then, after a long pause, "You remind me of myself." I stiffened, something inside me recoiling at that. I had spent my entire life trying to prove I wasn't him, that I was more than just his reflection. But standing here, staring into the eyes of the man who had shaped so much of who I was. I wondered if maybe I had been lying to myself. Maybe I wasn't just like him. Maybe I was worse. I exhaled, shaking my head. I guess that means I'm exactly where I belong. A flicker of something passed through his eyes, approval, amusement, maybe even regret. But it was gone before I could be sure. He nodded once, downed the rest of his drink, and set the empty glass on my desk. Then let's see what you do with it. And just like that, he was gone. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the spot where he had been, my thoughts racing. This was what I had wanted, what I had fought for. And yet, for the first time, I felt something unfamiliar creeping in. Not doubt, but something close. Because now that I had it, now that Sinclair and Partners was mine to shape, to control, to command, I had to ask myself a question I had never considered before. Did I really want it? The city stretched out before me again, endless, untouchable. I had spent years fighting to prove I deserved a seat at this table. But maybe the real power wasn't in sitting at the table at all. Maybe it was in knowing when to walk away. And maybe, just maybe, I was finally ready to do just that. I fought, I won. But in the end, was it really the victory I wanted? My father finally saw my worth. But by then, I had already learned the truth. I never needed his approval to begin with. Now, Sinclair and Partners is mine. But is power really worth it if you have to fight every day to keep it? Would you stay and rule or walk away and build something of your own? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget, like, share, and subscribe for more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Power isn't handed to you. Respect isn't given freely. In this country, you earn your place. You fight for it. No one cares about your last name, your legacy, or what you were supposed to inherit. What matters is what you prove. I learned that the hard way. I spent years waiting for recognition that was never coming until I took it for myself. That's the lesson. If you want something, take it. Outwork them, outsmart them. Make yourself undeniable. And when they finally acknowledge your worth, remember you never needed their validation to begin with. You made yourself. And that's real power.